Hello, everyone. Welcome to our regular sessions of Open Security Summit. We are excited to host you here, and we are looking forward to have greatest session. We already started very productive discussion, and I'm sure we will be continuing it. So I will start with quick introduction of myself. I will be hosting this session. My name is Tatevik, and I'm actually working as a project manager in Glassfall. We have very excited and motivated environment, so I'm really looking forward to this session as well, especially worldly mapping we have seen in our work environment in different security mappings and so on. So this is in other area to have some learning. So I really looking forward, and our presenter Chris will lead the session, and he will introduce himself and just continue all the summit. Thank you and enjoy.
Thank you. So yes, I'm going to talk to you about a practice, a method that's kind of been on my mind and mind of a few friends for over 2 years now, and we call maturity mapping. It's about contextualization, it's about change, it's about learning. So who am I? Let me see. So I am an Agile coach. I have been working in the Agile space for quite a while now. I've actually got too many grey hairs. I don't want to admit how long I've been doing this. But my previous kind of role was as a developer. I think it's interesting coming to speak at a security summit. I have no security background. There's very little I'll talk to you about with regard to security. But what I'll do is I'm going to give you a view of a practice which you can apply in many, many different contexts. I guess other bits about me, I am a founder and retired organiser of a conference called Lean Agile Scotland, which I ran here in Scotland from 2012 to around 2017. I have an interest in complexity theory, systems thinking, social practice theory, which we'll go into quite a bit today. And if you want to tweet at me, follow, have a chat on Twitter, I am Chris McD. Maturity mapping itself also has its own Twitter account, which is much easier to remember, which is @maturity-mapping. So today, I'm going to take you on a little journey. I'm going to start with telling a story, and I'm going to use maturity maps to visualize that story. As I go along telling you the story, I'm going to show you the elements of maturity mapping. And then once we've done that, I'm going to dive in a little bit further and do a bit of a recap and give you the anatomy of a map. We'll talk a little bit about what we're mapping. We'll look at a little bit around complexity. We'll look at social practice theory. We'll have a bit of a part around maps, why maps not models. We can talk a little there about how maturity mapping compares to the likes of maturity models. And then what we'll do is we'll kind of wrap up with a canvas that we've been using recently on how we do maturity maps. And I'll flip out of Keynote into Miro and I'll take you through, and we can maybe add some elements to a map that I've got prepared. So for those of you, so this is the TLDR. This is the point in which you ask yourself, do I want to spend the next hour discussing maturity mapping, or have I got need to catch up on Queen's Gambit and Netflix? Maturity mapping is an approach to visualize capabilities described as a group of integrated practices. This is key. These descriptions, this visualization then helps us provide insights that we can use for interventions and improvements. So how we can see environments, organizations, and what things we might want to change with regards to capabilities to better serve the needs of the organization. It focuses on practices to understand these organizations and uses social practice theory as the method of analysis. And we kind of round this up as a way to map practices across an organization. So we use this from executive layers down through to teams and individuals, and help us understand how they connect, how these layers and how these groups and these teams connect using practice across an organization. The ideas I'm going to talk about are predominantly come from these four people. Simon Wardley, obviously, it's mapping we're talking about. Maturity mapping in itself is a different framing, another framing of Wardley mapping. This might make a bit more sense later on, but we reckon that Wardley mapping has a bias towards material things, where we say with maturity mapping, our bias is towards competencies and skills and know-how. Dave Snowden has inspired us a lot with his ideas from the Cynefin framework and complexity theory. Elizabeth Shove, we'll talk a lot about Elizabeth's work with regard to social practice theory. And then Jabe Bloom, a number of his ideas are littered through here, and he's one of our kind of big supporters of maturity mapping. He's helped guide us with various different ideas and feedback on maturity mapping. So the example, the story I'm going to tell, I'm going to tell a story about a transformation in a government organisation. This is a government organisation here in Scotland that myself and a number of other mappers have been working at for a while. The story of the organisation I'll pick up around 2018, where we talk a little bit about the transformation the organisation's been going through. To give you a little more context, the organisation is a land registry organisation, holds Scotland's land registers, and holds the oldest land register in the world, and has been going now, I think it's in its 403rd year as an organisation. So an agile transformation in a 403-year-old organisation has been fun, has been a good challenge. As we go through, I'm going to take you down through various layers of maps. We can layer maps in different ways, but for this example here, we're kind of talking about them, and it helps us in an organisation to talk about them through these different levels, because we've set these kind of levels resonate with the generic frames of organisations. So what we'll do is we'll talk about a map from a perspective of an executive. We'll look at the map the way an executive would see the organisation, an executive layer, executive management team. Then we'll look at it from a kind of middle management type layer, a leadership type layer, looking at maybe a service function department sort of thing. And then we'll dive down into teams. And what we'll also do is I'll show you a map that goes across those layers and integrates practices that executives use right down to practices that teams use. So let's start with this executive one, as I said. So I'm going to take you back to 2018, and this is, I'm racking my mind to think if this is the first map ever created, or if it is the second maturity map ever created. I kind of just maybe give you a little bit more context before we dive in. Maturity mapping, it was a kind of initially an idea I had to help me understand how a number of software teams worked. I had been familiar with Wardley mapping. Mark Bergauer, who's my other mapping co-conspirator, introduced me to Wardley mapping, and we brought Simon Wardley to Lean Agile Scotland in 2015, I believe. And I was really inspired by the concepts of mapping, but at the time not being in a space where I could discuss strategy, I was unsure how best I could use it. And then it struck me that we could use it through the practice lens to try and understand teams. So I think this, as I said, this may have been the first map I did. It may have been the second. I'm not sure. I'll have to troll my archives to find out. But so this is an executive view of capabilities within an organization. And the goal here, the anchor, as we described at the top there, is to transform to efficiently and effectively fulfill a statutory role. So the land registry organization I'm talking about has a statutory role to play in Scotland. And off the back of housing market perturbations in the early 2000s, sorry, late 2000s, sorry, they decided to go around, change and improve the way they worked. And a large part of what they had to do was a digital transformation. So we picked this up in 2018. It had been going through a digital transformation. It made some progress, but it decided to kind of reconfigure its approach to transformation. And what we did is we mapped the capabilities that it had at the time in order to start making decisions about how we would go about this transformation. So first thing we kind of feel we need to do when we're thinking about transformation is think about it from the concept of design. And some capabilities we thought about and we believe we needed in order to go through this transformation were service design capabilities and organizational design capabilities. So as you can see on the map, service design, the box service design is further up on the y-axis than organizational design. That is service design for the organization we're mapping was more, our customers were more aware of our service design capabilities and how we were doing service design than they were of our organizational design. That was something that was more less visible to them. What you can also see in the x-axis is the kind of maturity scale from concept through emerging to good and best. And with service design in particular, what we had done was we'd gone through one project in which we had done service design. We had got value from service design, and we believe the capabilities, the service design capabilities, would be key to our ongoing transformation. So this was something we were interested in mapping and understanding and seeing how we could improve. Moving on, we looked then at the practices or the capabilities around product management, product development, and enterprise architecture. In particular, enterprise architecture here is a capability that we thought we were I guess quite immature in. We didn't have an enterprise architecture function. We were technical architecture, team level architecture, product level architecture was good. But that sat as a responsibility of product development teams, which you can see off on the right. But the enterprise architecture was something we struggled with. Change, how we communicated change, how we dealt with digital uptake, and how we did change management within the organization, again positioned based on how we felt those capabilities were back in 2018. IT operations, similarly, how we dealt with security, platform management, positioned how we felt at the time. And we also we looked at our governance and we looked at financial management. As I said, as we went forward, then we decided how are we going to move and improve this situation in order to transform the organisation to say effectively fulfil its statutory role. We realised that service design was, as I was saying earlier, one of the key things we had to do. So the decisions made around here were to hire a head of service design and start to grow a function, start to internally grow that function and build those capabilities into the organisation. Similarly with product management, we had product owners within our organization, and the product owners were working in sort of agile teams, but we felt we had to make a step further forward in our product management capabilities. So we decided we're going to hire a head of product and start to move from a project-based approach to delivery to a product-based approach. Also, we felt with an organization that's 400 years old, it's got technology that's what, 50, 60 years old roughly. We needed to really understand our architecture, and our goal here was to understand it in a way that we could then start to maintain it and improve it safely. So enterprise architecture was a capability we wanted to grow. Now, interestingly, the arrow goes the opposite way here with governance. What we wanted to do is introduce a leadership team that was responsible for strategy and governance, but we recognised the approach to governance we were taking through a project-based approach to delivery wasn't working. It wasn't suitable. It wasn't allowing for the kind of complex space we were in, and it wasn't sort of allowing us to adapt to our customer needs. We were binding things up in projects and it wasn't working. So what we said we had to do here was completely reconfigure our governance approach and take a new approach to it. Fast forward, 3 years now, and we're in this position. We have to point out two things in particular here. We have our enterprise architecture has made a significant move from being a concept, something we were aware of, we needed, to being something we feel we do well, we're doing repeatedly, but we still believe there are aspects of improvement in it. Our governance did that sort of slingshot back and then forward again, and we're in a position now where we feel comfortable with our governance. But what we recognise with our shift from a project managed approach to a product managed approach, we started to was something new for the government organisation. So actually the financial management, the mechanisms of financial management have to change, and this is something we're talking about on a regular basis. I was in conversations over the last couple of days about how we deal with our financial management, how we work with that within our teams. Next interesting thing to do here is take a step down. So we've looked at this from a capability perspective. Now let's have a look at what this meant to a specific group within the organisation. So this is now, we're in 2020, this is a map that represents the lean governance group that we have. It's customers executive, and the need the executive has of this group is to give confidence in strategy and delivery. One thing to note here that's key and different between the map you just saw a second ago, not only have we gone down a layer within the organisation, what we are now talking about predominantly on this map is practices and not capabilities. There is one capability on this, it's represented as product sustainability mapping as a capability the organisation has developed. We represent that as a square. That is to say we believe there's more practices that go together to provide that capability of product sustainability mapping, but the rest are all practices that are directly used by this group. I could go through, we could talk about the position of these practices. There's maybe a couple of things of interest to call out here. I'm not going to go through and talk about all the positions, but what you can see here is a contextualized governance approach. There are things here that you might not see if you pick up texts on lean governance. You're unlikely to see something around monthly status reports or benefits reporting. Those are practices you probably wouldn't associate with lean governance, but by contextualizing practice to this organization, we've developed practice that's appropriate for the organization. So monthly stats reports for a government organization is important. They need a record of decisions that are made. They need a record of things that were delivered. They need a record of risks, issues, and how they've been managed. And actually having this in place has been beneficial. We have just gone through an audit on our approach to benefits and reporting, etc., and how we govern. So we need that there. And again, just to reiterate, it's about contextualization. This message I'll go over again and again. It's about the practices we use and contextualizing them to the environment we work in. Now, what we want to do next is maybe we want a little bit more information here. How do we understand these practices a little bit better? So what we've developed over the years we've been doing maturity mapping is this idea of practice cards. Practice cards are built on the ideas of social practice theory. I will come on to that later. But what we basically have is a practice. It has a name. Practices generally have, in the name of a practice, there's an ing. It's something we do. So we have capacity planning. We understand the purpose of capacity planning. So agree priorities, understand competencies. We have an understanding of the tools we need in order to use this practice, skill liquidity matrix, etc. And key to this as well is we have an understanding of doing it well looks like. What would this practice look like at best? And this is something I'll talk again about later on, but for us, this is a key aspect for us to understand how we position a practice. So in a group, as we discuss our practices and we discuss what doing it well looks like, we get a shared understanding of the practice that way. And we also have a kind of less emotional way of positioning a practice. We can think about it in conjunction with how we have described it and how we've described doing it well. Moving on, give you another perspective, another view. So this is a kind of outside-in view of a team. So this is one of our teams who work for the conveyancing solicitors. That's their customers. They provide access to the land register data. And they have a bunch of kind of practices and capabilities, that you would expect to see on any kind of software team. There's user research, design, analysis, do planning and refinement, manage the flow of their work. There's build, testing, deployment and release, and version control. And so this gives us an interesting view of this team. You can see this is quite a mature team. They've got quite mature practices. This is one of the teams that for me as an Agile practitioner, I spend very little time with, our practice spends very little time with. But what's interesting here is if we can then approach this and start to understand this from the perspective of multiple teams. We can start to look across our suite of teams and start to say, what are all the capabilities across these teams and how do we help them? Or more importantly, how can they help each other improve? So for example, the grey box team, our customer information team, or a mapping team, for example, we could sort of introduce into our practices they use into our registration tools team, the yellow box, to say like, how do we help you improve your user research capabilities? How do we help them? How can they help each other and grow those skills and capabilities across the team? The map here helps us visualize those capabilities that the teams have, and then have those conversations with them. Going on and going down a level again, we can then start to look at maybe specifically practices around a capability. So we have specific practices around for the customer information team around deploy and release. This is a map that one of our colleagues, Joe, in the practice developed in the last couple of weeks. And he's been going around the teams, trying to help them understand how they do deployment and release, with the view for some teams of how we're moving to AWS and how the practices might have to be reconfigured and changed for that. So interesting, again, we see practices, we see dots, we see positions, we see context that are specific to the team. We see that the team here has pipelines for code deployment and pipelines for infrastructure, and that's something that this team does, and that's something this team takes care of. But what's interesting here to add in is the team, as the team sees the map and recognizes where it needs to improve, it can also start to articulate where the blockers are, what are the conditions that are in place in the environment that's stopping improvement, that are constraining improvement. So for example, we look at our vulnerability scanning, and in order to improve our vulnerability scanning, we recognize that there is an issue. We have an issue with the compatibility of rail patches. I wish I could give you that more more detail, especially it's a security conversation. But what we're trying to visualize here is a constraint, an issue, a blocker, something that's slowing the improvement, or is constraining the improvement and making the improvement, the move to right, more difficult for that team. Again, another practice card. I won't go through this, but again, we have name. What's the practice? What do we call it? What's the purpose of this practice? Again, just maybe here, this is a good point for the group who are mapping their practices to have this conversation about the purpose. Why do we do this? What's the need for this practice? Again, tools and doing it well. The next map I want to show you now is a map that takes us across these kind of layers of an organization and links together the practices required. So if we think about, so this is about vertical alignment. This is a map that allows us to transition these exec leadership and team level layers of an organization and look at how things integrate to help vertically align teams. We'll look at it this way, and I'm going to flip it around and look at it the other way as well. Look at it from the exec view. So we have the team, and you've got a team member here, a product team member, and their need is to understand what is the right thing to work on. So we have, first off, we have a series of practices around stories, user stories, the idea of writing those stories, and this is something we feel that's a strong practice generally within our community of teams. Managing backlogs and team planning, again, other strong practices. As we go down over to the next kind of layer, we see practices around product roadmap development and practices further still that are further away from our team member around transformation roadmap development. And in here is a practice of linking. How do we link these two? And we do this through a process of briefing and back briefing. This is something that's, when we originally mapped this maybe over a year ago, that was a practice we felt was we had done in a couple of times, but we knew there was some work required to do that. If I was to give you the up-to-date version of this map, that had moved significantly further to the right, maybe sort of reaching the boundary of emerging and good. And then we have how this links through to the practices that our executive use to set direction for the organization through corporate planning and KPI target setting and corporate risk management. So how they all connect together to ensure that this product team member understands what the right thing to work on is. And we can look at these practices not just as independent things. I think through the connections of these practices, we can start to understand how information is shared, and how conversations happen, and how artifacts that exist within transformation roadmaps and product roadmaps and team backlogs, how they link together and how we understand that they link together. So this is a pretty good map. This has been really helpful for us to understand that, how we improve our approach to vertical alignment. Flipping it entirely on its head, moving our exec to to the top of this map and their need to have confidence that the team members are working the right thing, we can start to see it from their perspective. Positions haven't changed here. We're just looking at it from another lens. We're looking at it from their lens. And again, this allows us to ask questions about how we improve this situation, how we, where are the points in which maybe alignment fails and alignment falls down for us. So I've kind of gone through a story. I've told you a story about the organisation. I've presented some maps in that organisation. What I want to do is kind of reflect back on a map. What makes a map, and what makes maturity maturity maps. So what you have is an X and Y axis. X-axis shows us the maturity in context. And you have the Y-axis, which is our capabilities, the capability chain that exists, and how visible that is into the needs and the customer whose needs this set of practice and capabilities serve. That's that. We also have what we've developed over time.
If you want, there is a question about axis. I think you answered, but do you want to answer just as you are talking about it to give a bit more information of it?
Yeah, absolutely.
There was question from Mario. What did it take to get agreement on what each of the X-axis evolution stages means in the local context?
So I'll talk about that just in the next. Can I talk about that in the next slides? I think what the next slide sort of talks a little bit more about the practice cards and how we use the practice cards and elements of the practice cards to help us understand that agreement of maturity in local context. I'll come back to that. I'll talk about the cheat sheet or the guides for those stages at that point, if that's okay.
Yeah, Mario already mentioned that even this slide is answering to his question, so let's move forward. Perfect.
Fantastic. Okay, so let's start with the map. If those of you familiar with Wordly maps, this is be really obvious to you. But what we have here is an anchor, and the anchor is the need and the customer. What's that customer and what's their need? We then have our components which sit in the map, and in this instance, these components are capabilities we position in the map, and we have the position that we'll put them in. Again, I'll talk about that in a bit more detail in the next slide. We also have concepts of movement. Now, this is something that I find pretty interesting. Typically with a Wordly map, what we have is a movement from left to right. We would call that in the maturity mapping sense, develop. We're developing and improving a practice capability. And that happens through sort of supply and demand. That's everything moves to the right, everything evolves as we see in a Wordly map. But what we have here is multiple movements. Because of practices, we have multiple options that we kind of discuss when we're trying to improve. So typically, do we want to move it right? Do we want to develop that practice? And that's a very obvious movement. The other movement I showed at the start was a reconfiguration movement. I'll talk a little bit more about reconfiguration later on when we get into social practice theory, but reconfiguration is a step back. It's taking back to reconsider the practice and how that practice works, in the belief that the reconfiguration of the practice will help us then improve it and move it right. We then have exposed. So if there's practices we do that we believe should be more visible to our customers, we want to move the practice up. Or if there's practices we do, we believe add noise to the conversation with our customers or aren't something we want our customers to particularly be aware that we do, we would then hide, we would pull that down. If we want to bring a new practice in, we call this introduce. This is the introduction of a new practice. And then another kind of introduction around the concept of competing. So say we have a practice that fulfills a particular need for us, and we want to introduce a new practice to compete with that practice to remove it, because we believe a new practice is something that will give us more value. So the example I use of this, and apologies, my developer background, if a practice we use is a unit testing, and the developers, when they do unit testing, it's something they do after the development of code, we might want to introduce the ideas of test-driven development, which we believe helps with our design and helps with the speed of feedback and the development of code. but would compete with our practice of unit testing. It was something that might dislodge and remove unit testing from our practice space. What else have we got? I've presented all of these kind of key aspects of the map. So the squares we call capabilities. Capabilities we'll talk about again a little later on. Circles we call practices. Blockers, so the tall dark lines, movements and arrows. Groups are the kind of bounded box, which we can aggregate across multiple different spaces that are different teams or different contexts that use similar practice to have a kind of joined up evaluation. And then what we can have added in here as well a little bit is how we can see the change, and we have like previous practice. So we can map and then overlay a map, sorry, with previous practice and where those previous practices sat. Going a little bit more detail then on the positioning of a practice. So we have the cheat sheet along the bottom. So we have a concept, the awareness of the practice, we're experimenting with the practice. Emerging, we believe this is when we're getting to grips with the practice and we're getting value from the practice. When the practice isn't good, we see we're doing some aspects of the practice repeatedly, but it needs improvement. I'm sorry, my practice card hides this, but underneath best it is that we believe this practice is an example of what good looks like. Some teams or other groups might want to come and learn a practice from you because you're recognized as doing it as an exemplar of a practice. It'd be a practice that would do the aspects of the practice that we call out repeatedly. All of aspects of the practice we call it repeatedly, and also it would be a practice where we would see little need for improvement. So when it comes to position, when we create a practice card before we position, by describing what doing it well looks like, we can evaluate doing it well against that criteria I've just described along the x-axis. So in this instance, what we've got is a couple of ticks. I'm just doing this as a kind of visual, but we can see that, yes, when we do capacity planning, every time we do it, priorities are clear. But relative estimation isn't something we're particularly happy with. That's something we want to improve. And when we do it, we tend to miss decision makers. They're not always present at the event. And however, horse trading and dependency conversations take place. These are key aspects of the practice. So we know that if we want to get better at this practice, those are two elements that we might want to look at: estimation and the presence of decision makers at the sessions. So why then? What motivated us? What motivates us to map practices and try and understand organizations through these maps and their capabilities and practices? So as being agile coaches, being an agile coach, and Mark also is an agile coach, we recognise that organisations often see the world through what we call here a traditional view. They have that Cartesian view, that Adam Smith view, that kind of splitting of work, the Taylorist view of work. They start to think of their organisations as machines with interchangeable parts. But this is problematic. It leads to what Jay Bloom calls gap thinking when it comes to change. Gap thinking is this idea that we would examine our current condition. We would then imagine a future and the role of changes in closing the gap. And we think, because we have this sense that because organizations are machines, that this movement to close the gap is something that can be planned. We can follow a series of steps. Gap thinking, however, brings us a bunch of problems. The idea of the time, the political capital spent in imagining our future, the investment people put into this imagining of what might be within an organization. We have sunk cost fallacy, the investment that's been put into something, we must see through this investment. Key one for me is the devaluation of the present. We don't, by examining a current condition and then looking ahead, what we often tend to do is devalue what our current condition is and not think about what those capabilities are, what those needs are that exist in our current condition, and how best to use, evaluate, and improve. We devalue the constraints that they provide for us in the present. And then again, what we also have is this idea of long feedback cycles. We have this view that by imagining a future state, we'll get there, but we're not sure, as we all, I guess, have experienced things like this. When we get there, if we ever get there, the feedback that we would have given ourselves is kind of lost. It's unable to be implemented. So what I guess we need to think about is organisations in a slightly different way. And I'm going to stop talking for a second and hand over to Russ Lakoff here, who can tell us.
First, what's a system? A system is a whole, spelled with a W, that consists of parts, each of which can affect its behavior or its properties. You, for example, are a biological system called an organism, and you consist of parts, your heart, your lungs, your stomach, pancreas, and so on, each of which can affect your behavior or your properties. The second requirement is that each part of the system, when it affects the system, is dependent for its effect on some other part. In other words, the parts are interdependent. No part of a system or collection of parts of a system has an independent effect on it. Therefore, the way the heart affects you depends on what the lungs are doing and the brain is doing. The parts are all interconnected. And therefore, a system is a whole that cannot be divided into independent parts. Now, that has some very, very important implications that are generally overlooked. First, the essential or defining properties of any system are properties of the whole which none of its parts have. For example, a very elementary system you are familiar with is an automobile. The essential property of an automobile is it can carry you from one place to another. No part of an automobile can do that. The wheel can't, the axle can't, the seat can't, the motor can't. The motor can't even carry itself from one place to another. But the automobile can. You have certain characteristics, the most important of which is life. None of your parts live. You have life. You can write. Your hand can't write. That's easy to demonstrate. Cut it off and put it on the table and watch what it does. Nothing. You can see. Your eye can't see. You can think. Your brain can't think. And therefore, when a system is taken apart, it loses its essential properties. If I bring an automobile into this room and disassemble it, although every single part's in this room, I don't have an automobile. Because the system is not the sum of the behavior of its parts, it's a product of their interactions.
So to summarise, I guess, what Russ is kind of saying to us there is that we need to think about wholes. We need to think about organisations as wholes and think about them through the interdependencies, the relationships that happen within those wholes with the parts that integrate within those systems. He's kind of taken us away from this mechanistic view of separated parts and a focus on the parts to help us then focus on how the parts interact and the interdependence that those parts have. What also I think would add to this is the concept of complexity and the ideas of complex adaptive systems theory, which are important to think about when we're thinking about organisations and we're thinking about change within organisations. Mark Bergauer, he has a lovely example of slime mold. He is a biologist. I cannot give you that example of slime mold with any conviction. So I'm going to talk about football and use football as an example for a complex adaptive system. So again, to reiterate a little bit what Russ is saying, a system is parts which interact to meet a purpose. In a complex system, like in a sports environment, like a game of football, when these parts interact and something new emerges from these parts, and that newness, that novelty, that thing that wasn't particularly expected, might not have been expected, changes the behaviour of the parts, then you get this complexity. Then you get this idea of evolvingness and something that's different that's going to happen that may not be quite expected. So if you think about in the example of sports, this is my son here. He playing a number of years ago. He's coming down the left wing here. He's maybe gone past this fella who's coming towards him before, so he understands how he's going to behave. Maybe he's tried to go past him on the right before and that didn't work, and this time he's going to go left. Or maybe he'll lift his head this time for once and pass into his friend who's got a better opportunity. Because of the movement of these parts and experiences he's had before in the game, particularly this game, he'll think about things differently, he'll behave differently, he will act differently. But complex systems are dispositional. There is a likelihood they're going to form in a particular way. The two teams we have here, my son's team at the time were at the top of the league they were playing in, and the team they were playing against were at the bottom of the league. This game was disposed to a positive outcome for my son's team. But what's key for us here is to try and understand how we make sense of these environments. How can we start to understand them, and how maps can then help us understand these environments? What's the sense-making approach we need to take? And I'll come back to that again as well. But what I think key here is that when we start to think about wholes, we start to think about systems, we start to move away, and we start to think about emergence and interdependence. We start to move away and start to move our thinking away from this mechanistic view. And we can stop thinking about future states, and we can think about ideal current states. We can think about where we are and what we need to do now, what constraints are in place with regards to the relationship to the goal, and what kind of improvements and steps do we need to take. This allows us to kind of understand the information we're receiving when we try things and move and change things, and integrate that into our way of thinking, how we see the world and how we visualize the world, and how we can then respect and understand the practices that exist and the things that exist in that space, and have continuity of those. So if I go back to our first map, we had the idea that there was practices in the map that we wanted to nudge and improve around service design and product management, but we realized that there was practices we actually had to extract and re-experiment with and try and do different things. We had to remove those constraints and try something new. What we think about this is a nice phrase from Complexity World as well, is when we think about this, we think about what's the adjacent possible? What's that kind of shadowy future that sits in front that we can then move towards, that will let us learn and move, understand a little bit more for our next steps of improvement. So what are the things we're mapping then? We've talked about the kind of environment, the complex environment, we've looked at maps. So what are these things that sit on maps? So what we want to do is shift our focus away from individuals when we're trying to understand the environment, shift away from the behaviours and motivations of the individual, and then start to think about the world through a practice lens. Start to think, as Bruno Latour would say, work as a site of practice. What are the practices we do? And think about workers as practitioners, people who practice in any context. What is a practice? Well, first of all, if we think back to the maps I was showing, I talked a lot about capabilities. Capabilities themselves, as we see them, are an integration of practices. So multiple practices that integrate together in order to create that capability. As is the way with maps and the different scales we can view maps, we can also see capabilities integrating with practices to create capabilities. But then what is a practice? How is a practice constituted? So social practice series would suggest that a practice, Elizabeth Shaw would suggest a practice is the integration of meaning, material and competence. It's the reasoning why we do something, the skills and the know-how we have in order to do that, and the tools and the material things we use in order to do that. And you can see some of that reflected in our practice cards we talked about earlier on. Through this integration of meaning, competence and material in practice, we can see how each of these elements inform each other, how they interact together and kind of can change. We can think about the practice often, if you use, like, you're building a IKEA thing, and you might need a screwdriver. So you use that screwdriver, and the material you have is a screwdriver. The competencies is the pressures and whatnot you need to know, and the turning approach you would take, and the sizing and fitting of that. And the meaning is the construction of the thing you want to create, that IKEA flat pack thing. But if you change the material here, meaning might stay the same. It might be the same reasoning for acting in a particular way, but what you might have is a material change. Like, you might bring in here an electric screwdriver. So with bringing in that electric screwdriver, you also have to think about your competencies and how the skills you have in order to do this practice change. So you're now thinking more about torque, you're thinking more about how you avoid shredding the end of that screw, which I've done many times with electric screwdrivers, and how you apply that pressure. So you've got this idea that practice is this concept of meaning, material, and competence, and each of those, as they're integrate, inform each other in different ways. But the practice can be seen and observed as this practice in this example of putting a screw in a cabinet or whatnot. The evolution of social practice theorists would suggest that the evolution of practice is kind of quite simple, and there are 3 steps to the evolution of practice. Practices are proto-practices, i.e. there is meaning, there is material, there is competence that exist in a space, but they've never been integrated. So that practice may be conceptual, but may never have been practiced. It may never have been enacted, and there have been no practitioners using that practice or creating that practice. Once those practices are integrated, we then have, those elements are integrated, we then have our practice. We can then see how that practice operates and practice works and how we practice it and share it with others. But then we have, as we go on, we have X practice. That is practice we no longer enact anymore. Those things are no longer being integrated. The material, meaning, and competence are no longer being integrated. They might still exist, they might still be around, but they're never integrated. They're no longer something we can do. We would have to reconstitute the practice, relearn the practice, and reintegrate those things to then reuse the practice. If we think about how practice evolves over time, we can see the meanings may change of a practice, but we could still think of it as the practice and described. The materials may change and the competencies may change. So if you think about driving in the 1920s, the meaning that surrounded driving in the 1920s, the practice of driving, would be something like leisure. We would want to go and experience different parts of the country, and driving would allow us to do that. So it'd be a leisure activity. Whereas the meaning has evolved in practice. We now have meaning around commuting. Yeah, it's something the driving practice is the meaning has evolved. It's now more likely to be more disposed to be a commuting meaning and need from the practice of driving than it was around leisure. Competencies also have changed over time. The obvious ones are how we start the car, but maybe less obvious ones is how the roads have changed, and our competencies have to change to adapt to them. Early driving, I suspect the rear view mirror was not something that was of that great importance, but as we've moved on and we have dual carriageway roads and things like that, the mirror and understanding your broader surroundings are important. So you need the competencies in order to do that. Another interesting thing to think about in the evolution on the change and how practices change over time is that we often find that competencies, shown here in the red dots, get materialized. They find themselves in a tool. So if you can imagine, off the top of my head, a deployment process. Back in the day, certainly when I was a dev in the early days, prior to a kind of good understanding of build scripts, building an application and deploying an application was a series of steps that you would take and you would put into the command prompt, as an example. But over time, what we see is those competencies, those steps that you would take have been materialized. They become programmatic. So we see that practice can evolve in such a way that the material consumes the competence, and we no longer need to know. So again, looking back, we can think about social practice theorists would call this integration of many practices we see here as a complex. We've kind of called them, for more kind of generic term, capabilities. But what you can see is the practice of driving, or the capability of driving, if you want, is made up of the integration of many practices. So accelerating, as you can see, that as a practice, it has meaning, material, and competence. Braking is a practice, steering is a practice, and they all integrate together themselves to give us this practice of driving. So it kind of leads to the point where, certainly I think I tweeted this about 6 months ago, maybe longer. You see practices everywhere. It's kind of, if you have experienced that view that Russ Lakoff described of systems thinking, when you start to see systems and integration of things everywhere. Social practice theory has done the same thing for me. You start to see practices everywhere, and it started to become a really interesting way of articulating what we have and what we see on our maps. So the next point in our journey is why maps.
Sorry, Chris, because there is a question about the practices. Might be you can answer that before passing to the next point.
Absolutely, yeah.
So the question is from Akshay, and it is about X practice. If it isn't needed or used anymore, then isn't it likely that the tools have been removed? So while the meaning might still exist and competence isn't in people's head, so if only 2 out of 3 elements are there, is it correct to still refer to the collection as a practice?
I think you can refer to it as a practice because it's a practice that has been, we call it an X practice. It's something that has been, you could see the integration that happened in the past. But it's not, that's a very valid point. The material could disappear. We could no longer have the material required in order to do that practice. I think it would still, as long as we still know what that material was, as long as we can still remember what that material was, we could possibly describe that practice. But maybe we could never reconstitute it. We could never do it again. It's not something we could redo.
Yeah, Mark had a good point that the tools will be part of different practices now. The meaning might remain or change. So what also you mentioned.
Yep, the tools could go and still exist in different spaces and different practices. The example that Elizabeth Shove uses in her book is the example of creating ink as an X practice. It's something, you know, maybe in the kind of early 1900s, people had to know what to do in order to write. They had to know how to make ink. But now it's not something we necessarily need to know. We don't need to know how to do that. So for many of us, we could consider this an X practice. It's not something we need to do. Ink is now available to us in pens. It's not something we have to think about and consider.
And there is point from Mario, and we can sum up this. I still think there is a room for InfoSec to focus less on the tried people, process, and technology, and focus more on meaning, competence, and artifacts. It is a different lens, a more practice-focused one. So what people actually do.
Yep. Yep. So I have an example later on. It's not a full example, but a kind of theoretical example later on of how the movement of practice between teams or between spaces, between contexts, really asks us to think about those things, those meaning, material, and competence that exist. But yes, I agree with Mario there. Okay, so why maps and not models? Some of you might be familiar with some of these images. These are kind of typical maturity models. We have, in some instances, poor most instances, poor visualizations. I could be harsher. Poor visualizations that don't give us kind of agency. We can't do much with them. If we look at our Deloitte landscape, one of Mark and I's favourite examples is that on that's particular visualization of practice, there are certain practices you cannot get to. There is no journey that will allow you to get to them. So I think it's the Cynefin framework and right shifting are these floating things. So it's kind of poor visualization in that perspective. What we also see is, like, I think more importantly, it's the visualizations. These maturity models are static. They don't change. They have defined what mature is, and what they've also done is define what mature is across a suite of practices. And not only that, but suites of practices that are of particular interest to groups. So we have agile maturity models, we have Kanban maturity models, we have, you know, that are, we don't, I think as an agile coach, I recognize we don't just do these things, we do many other things that we integrate in together with agile practices and lean practices and development practices. We integrate them together. So actually having decontextualized static models focuses away from what we are doing in our context, but towards this model, and this model's static articulation of what good looks like, to go back to what we had earlier on. They also have kind of linear paths, their expectation that given certain criteria, we would put you at level 1, and certain other criteria will put you all the way up. And in order to get from level 1 to level 5, you have to go through a series of steps. And these steps are steps that this model would describe, but we would not maybe go through in practice. We might evolve in an entirely different way. We might skip many of the steps. We might go sideways on these steps instead of following them up the path. Mark had a really interesting tweet a number of years ago, which actually I can't see because Zoom has put you all on top of it. If I can move Zoom, I can't. I'll let you read that at your leisure when you get it. But what we also have is kind of the view of maturity models as being, a model and a context-free model, saying that mature for a multinational is also mature for a 30-person company. So it's counterintuitive to look at what mature is for a multinational, and then try and compare a small startup to that. It conflates, and I touched on this a little second ago, it conflates the level of effectiveness with a learning path. It has a linear path they often have linear paths for learning. You need to be here, then here, then here, then here, and so on. And a friend, Trent Hone, describes them as a treasure map where X marks the spot, but there is no information on the terrain. You've no idea how to navigate your way around this. And they're often held by our high priests, our certification gurus, who cast out to us the rights and wrongs of how we should approach particular method, particular practice. Maturity models, though, I think can be interesting. They are decontextualized experience, as I kind of touched on a second ago. The context is removed from them in order to describe them. And they kind of describe recontextualization as customization. You have the bounds of the practice they've described in their model, and you have to customize it to fit for your environment. Whereas probably what you want to do is not customize, but tailor. You want something that is specifically designed for your environment. And I'll take you back to my example of monthly status reports. Again, a maturity model around governance, lean governance would not suggest we do that sort of thing, but we have tailored and introduced that practice. So what I think is an interesting thing here also to consider is that when we look at the decontextualized practice that a maturity model describes, maybe one of the harder things and the more important things in that as well is to have the skill and the understanding of how to contextualize them. How do you bring them into your own environment and act on them and use them in your own environment? So I want to touch a little bit more on that. So if you think about, again, here's a map, here's some generic practices that meet a need. And I've gone a little deeper with these, don't necessarily do these in practice, but what we have here is the constructs of practice described. So we have the meaning, material, and competence, this little kind of trio described. And we can start to think about the relationships that exist between practices. The meanings, they coexist because the meanings are comfortable. The meanings that they share are right and compatible meanings. The competencies that exist across practice, they are also shared. They can also exist in that an environment comfortably. They have skills that are matched across practices. And also we could think about the materials. The materials may be comfortable to exist across practice. But then if we think about, we identify a practice in one context, we want to move to another, we have to think about how we decontextualize it, how we recognize it as a practice on its own, how we take that, how we can understand it, and understand the kind of the boundaries of it as a practice, and then consider how we store it. The decontextualization is interesting. We're taking it out, we're disentangling it from the environment it exists in. But when we store it and we think about it and we hold that information, that practice, we can't leave that context behind. We can't forget that context exists, because when we go to recontextualize it, we then have to think about how we connect it back in to a new environment. How we look at those meanings, materials, and competencies, and how they are appropriate or not to the environment in which we're introducing a new practice. Stephen Kemmis, social practice series, uses a really lovely phrase called stirring in. So introduction of new practice involves this idea of stirring in. How do we stir the practice into a new context in order for it to fit properly? Maybe an example would be like, how do we stir in, like, if you think about a context of a pot of soup, right? If we stir in the wrong ingredients, we could really spoil that pot of soup. If we stir in the wrong practice, we bring in the wrong places, we could really upset a particular environment and change its capability as a whole. Okay, so that's showing you some maps, sort of waffled on a little bit about some of the theory that sits behind the maps. What I want to do is give you a little bit of context along the journey we've had and show you an example of how we are now doing it. So the journey we've had, what we've learned along this journey is that positioning by consensus is a really interesting thing. Anyone who works in a team and understands the things teams do, the consensus around what it does is really important. So actually positioning by consensus is important. It allows us to create shared understanding about where something exists in a map and get better, deeper, or more accurate understanding, or more accurate reflection on a map of a practice, how it exists. What we've also learned is clear articulation of what we do is hard. So prior to us discussing and introducing social practice theory into our thinking and just thinking about practice as a very generic thing, I particularly found this hard to have conversation with people about practice generally, because they had different views. And this little board, or this little visual you see with that sticky on top of it, was a board that I developed with a group of people when I just asked the question, what is it we do? What are the things we do to get work done? And what I found on this, and again, this predates view of social practice theory, was things like tools, like Jira appeared on there, but not only did Jira appear on there, things like PMO appeared on there. Scrum appeared, but also stand-up meetings appeared. So there's this various different understandings of what it is we do are. Social practice theory and mapping via understanding of social practices has really helped give us this unit of analysis, give us this way of understanding what it is we do, and then have conversations about it and position it on maps to then help us improve. What we also learned was don't use context-free lists of practices. One exercise I had with the team, and probably one of the worst facilitations I've had, is maturity mapping, is where I laid out on a table all the practices I heard us use within our department and said to the team, which one of those do you use? They didn't understand what they were. This was my understanding of practice, it wasn't theirs. So using a context-free list is not a good shout, not a good idea. What really helped us develop this was when we introduced practice cards, and Mark had an experience introducing practice cards into an organisation he worked with, and they spent a couple of weeks in the development of the practice cards. It was like a slow motion analysis of their environment. Every time they did something, they would write a practice card and pop it on the wall. And then when it came to a point of reflection, they had all of these practices they could then talk about because they'd experienced them and they'd recorded them as they experienced them. The practice cards and how we've changed our practice cards to introduce doing it well helps us build a shared understanding of people's aspirations for the practice and their beliefs on how we could improve, and also makes positioning easy or easier. So when we put it on a board, we can start having a discussion about what doing it well looks like, as we've agreed, but then having a discussion then about what of those things that we've said that we would like it to be, how do we feel they are, how we're doing them, and then that allows us with the guide to position them on the x-axis. And then finally, having a canvas, having a facilitation method has been really helpful, and it's helped us kind of step through the process of creating maps. So what I guess I want to show you now is that canvas, and I'll talk you through an example on the canvas and we can kind of work it together. However, I'm going to have to stop sharing for a second. Well, everyone, I can now see your names and faces. I'm going to move over and I'm going to share a different tool with you all. I will just show my desktop because it doesn't let me see that as a single thing on its own. So what I have here, does everyone see this okay?
Yes, we can see you.
Excellent. So what we have here is a canvas we've been using over the last wee while in order to help us go through a process of analysing, understanding in the context, and then creating a map for it. So first thing we have is we have a conversation about context. Why do we want to create a map? What are we mapping? What are we not mapping? So the example I want to talk about, very generic, non-organizational type map here, is the idea of what we want to map is grocery shopping for the family. What we're going to do is grocery shopping at store and not online. How do we do that? So we then ask ourselves as we go through step 2, who's our customer? Who are we doing this work for? So in my experience here, this map here, we're talking about the family. I'm going to do grocery shopping for the family, and their needs are groceries. They need fed. People need they need their chocolate to survive lockdown. We need other the grown-ups in the house need other things to survive lockdown. Next thing we do is like, what do we do in order to meet this need? What are the practices we use to meet this need? How do we do it? And the approach we take there is to populate a set of practice cards. And we can have series of discussion about what those practices are. Now, there are a number of ways how we can go from a blank canvas here of no practices to a series of things to start investigating. We can, with teams, we can do a kind of silent post-it noting what are all the things you do. Kenny, whose second name escapes me from the domain-driven design community, has spoken about how he's done event storming in order to understand all the practices a team would do prior to analysing the practice. My lean background would have his value stream mapping, looking at the steps that we would go through in order to fulfill that need and then identifying those practices. So what practices do we need in order to meet the need of getting the groceries for the family? So we've got dressing, we need to have clothes on. So what is the purpose of this? This is staying warm and dry, fitting in with society, not ending up in jail. What do we need here? We need clothes. These are the tools, these are material things, a space to dress, I suppose. A private space to dress might be something we could add in here. Then we have doing it well would be we follow social norms. We conform with society in our attire, and we are dressed for the appropriate weather conditions. Other things we'd see as we go along here is things like driving. We need to get to the store. I'm not going to go through all of the elements of the practice. We would need to park. We need a list of things to shop for. We need to select those items. We need to pay for them. We need to pack our car, and then we need to pack things away. So let's dive into this one a little bit. What's packing things away? So we would need to think about put things away to keep the kitchen tidy and food fresh. Yeah, we'd put things in the fridge if we need to. What would we have? We'd have cupboards. We would have fridge. Oops, spelling again. Fridge. Maybe we have a freezer. We need for that. And doing it well, what would that look like? We would have to make sure the fresh items or things going out of date are accessible. Accessible items. We put things in the freezer that need to go in the freezer, put things in the right space. You get what I mean. You get the kinds of things. So we would go through this approach of having a conversation about this practice and filling out this practice card. Those of you who are Miro users, this is like a super useful tool that we use for mapping. And what we've learned is that as we write the practices, we want to link those practices to a kind of little practice node that we then take and apply to our map. So I haven't mapped that yet, but what we have here is our understanding of what good looks like. I'm repeating myself here, and we kind of position those practices based on that. So packing away, how would we position that? We might position that at something that is visible to the family, but in our case is an emerging practice because we have made some changes to our kitchen and I don't know where everything goes yet. But if we look at this environment, we can then think about what it is we want to improve. And one of the things that stands out here is that dressing is maybe one of the things we need to consider as a practice we need to improve when we are doing this practice of shopping for the family. So we would look at this. Why do we want to do this? Well, we've found, or recently I found in a conversation on Twitter, that some people wear their pajamas when they go to the shops in lockdown. Stop wearing PJs when you're going shopping. That ain't cool. That doesn't comply to social norms. In the context here in Scotland, it would also be very, very cold. So idea would be to wear the appropriate attire when you go to the shop. That's the things we need to improve in this space when we are going shopping. That's one of the key things. So our note here for this practice, we'll annotate as number 1. Let me just put that number so we can all see it. Number 1 conforms to that note over there. Number 1, stop wearing PJs, wear the appropriate thing. That's what you're supposed to do when you go shopping. And that is me. If you want to find out more about this, we're obviously going to have a bit of conversation, but maturitymapping.com has a collection of all our blog posts on maturity mapping, at maturity mapping, or you can get in touch and follow the mappers, myself, Mark, who mentioned, Hilary, who works with us, has done all the great design, and Keith. Stop sharing.
Thank you, Chris, very much. I think everyone really enjoyed. So there were questions actually during also the session, and I didn't want to interrupt you. Also, there were a lot of great feedback to what you were showing. So how you want, like if you can go through, let me see. Yes, Mark said in the beginning that is great. Brilliant, love the map. There was a question about in the beginning when you were showing that if there is a possibility of download that version of the SPT cards.
We don't have it yet. We have. We could easily create this and put it on a PDF and make it available. We have them in Miro, so we can extract them from Miro, and I can put them in a Dropbox along with the canvas and the slide deck for others to reference, if that's helpful. Folks happy with
that? Yeah, there is also a question in the end about Miro, so we will come to that as well. Yeah, if any additional materials you have, we also can attach to the summit itself. There we have website and we are putting materials, so you can just give it to us.
Fantastic. Yeah, can do that. I'll send on the slides and the canvas and the cards.
Perfect. So let us move forward.
Yep.
Let us see. Yes, Axis we have answered. That is great. We have just good feedback. Akshay said about Axis again. I may have missed this. Is the maturity axis a self-racing or is it against industry capabilities? You have Mike covered. Yes, it.
Yeah. So I would say that it depends on how you describe your practice. If you want to describe your practice as how industry would describe the practice, if that's something that's important, appropriate to you, then that may be then how you use the doing it well and the positioning on the practice on the x-axis. But the kind of the positioning is your self-rating, like how we would position ourselves against that. So our guide says if you're aware of the practice but not doing it, it's on the left. And if you are comfortable with all the elements of that practice and you're doing them repeatedly and don't feel the need to improve them, then they're on the right. So that's how we do the rating of the practice. But how you describe the practice and the capabilities of practice, entirely up to you. That's the context in which you operate and you work in. It might be that you want to describe your practices against how industry would describe it. So there kind of a couple of ways in which we we've talked about the approach to understand the practice as the expert's view. So what does the expert think about the practices in the context? It's what we really, I guess, we encourage here is that they get the best understanding of the context in order to put your expert informed view on that. But the other is a kind of ethnographic view. It's the example I described that Mark did, where we, over a period of time, we identify practices and extract those practices. Hope that answered the question.
I'd actually posted a couple of follow-up remarks, Chris, right at the end.
Oh, crook. So did we discuss the X practice? Yes, we covered that.
Actually, maybe you can just ask your questions in live, just whatever we haven't answered, and if it is answering to your questions, because I'm going through chat. Okay.
Yeah, I'm happy for folks to come off. Like, if they want to just unmute and fire away, ask questions that kind of as you feel the need.
I'll take you up on that then. Sorry, I'm not going to come on camera because I'm also trying to stuff my face with dinner.
Go for it. Yeah.
So what I was just typing in the chat is, one of the common complaints I've had from clients as a consultant over the years is, we don't care what good practice might be out there, or dare I say best practice might be out there. We are unique, we are special, and we don't really care what these other guys are doing. But I kind of feel like there has to be a balance. I mean, if the accepted social norm is, in your example, to get dressed before you go grocery shopping, then you want to understand that, you know, there are some widely accepted norms.
Yep.
You can't say, well, we're special, so we're not going to get dressed.
Yep.
And we're going to go out naked, right? So there's a balance there as well.
There are rules in that one. Yeah.
That's what I was trying to refer to my first question, which is, do you assess yourself against what's out there, or is it purely a sort of self-assessment exercise when you start your mapping?
So I think you can use it in either way. So you could be so I've used maps as a consultant in the same way you've described, coming in with a short amount of time to have conversations with an organization to understand where they are. They've asked you in as a outside consultant, so applying your expertise and your understanding to the positioning of their practice is perfectly valid. Also, in the other way, actually within your group, your teams, understanding yourselves, what your practices are like and how you feel you would like to improve them and you feel is best for your context, because you know your context better than anyone else. It just may be that you don't have that outside systems view that I guess you can referring to, that a consultant might bring. So I think both are valid. It's perfectly reasonable to challenge someone's perspective if they appear not to have experience or understanding of practices around, I don't know, continuous delivery, modern software delivery practices, and this might be something that like the map can help you explain to them. What I think is also interesting, and maybe it's slightly tangential, but what it allows you to see is, but if you can map their practices as they are, the practice cards are really interesting ways of having them articulate the practices more, so you can get a bit more in depth, so you can understand that maybe while they think they're good at their practice in the space, the practice is, with the introduction of something they are unaware of, they have unconscious incompetence in, is something that you would bring in to challenge their practice. So when it happened over the years was, I would see is manual testing of software, and lots of organizations feeling that manual testing of software was the right way to go because there was so much nuance. But then the introduction of certain elements of automation, automated checking and that kind of thing was something they were unaware of. But by bringing it in, coaching, having those conversations and making them aware about how the practice they do now has to change and evolve in a different way, I think it's the maps, I guess, can help you with that.
Maybe also we're saying that the purpose of maps is to have these kind of discussions. There is not, the map's never correct, or there's not a true map that you're trying to find. It is literally a pathfinding or a tool to understand different perspectives and bring them together.
It's making sense of the environment to have those conversations.
Chris, you explained the idea of practice cards, and on the practice cards you define the how does doing it best looks like. You also showed that flipping a map changes the visibility from a certain standpoint. And I was thinking about that, and is it a safe assumption to say that the party for which something is most visible should define the how does doing it best looks like, because to that party they have the most interaction with that practice. So you can ask a party for who that process is totally invisible, but you will probably not get a lot of relevant feedback. Is that is that a safe assumption? Is that something that you also do in practice?
Yeah. So if you think about that map in particular, you've got executives and you've got teams. If you were to ask a team member how to write a corporate plan, it's something they've never experienced before, maybe read one, probably unlikely that they've read one. But if you ask an executive how to write a user story, again, it's something they've not experienced. One of the ideas which I find really interesting, I think, is Mario's here. Mario wrote a blog post about this. It's an idea that Jay Bloom shared with us around time spans of discretion, how different environments have different conversations and they think about work in different ways, primarily around time. That's why I keep doing this. But when you take an executive and put them into a software team, the conversations are incoherent. They don't understand that context because it doesn't necessarily revolve around a time and change that they would understand. So it's similarly with practice. You bring someone in who's entirely out with that context. Yes, maybe they could have a conversation about it, learn a bit about it, maybe or offer some kind of naive insight, but not necessarily be expecting our executive to write a practice card for story writing, for example.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so we have, I think, new messages. Let me check. There was reference to Simon Wardley maps. Moment. Okay, let me go to the last messages. Mario asked regarding different stakeholders' views and observability of actions. Yeah, and again about the axis. I don't know why I'm having difficulties to.
I think Mario's point, I think, links to his previous point. We were talking about the time span of discretion. Jay Bloom's ideas around time span of discretion.
Yeah, actually, again, would you position a practice along the x-axis to reflect the most immature element, or would you spread practice across multiple stages of the maturity axis?
Would you position a practice along the x-axis to reflect the most immature element, or would you spread a practice across multiple stages of the maturity axis? So a capability, I would think about this differently. So a capability, you might triangulate a capability on a map based on how dispersed the maturity of the practices are that create that capability. Practices, however, I think are the things we would see as that kind of singular unit of analysis. When we come to a map, we don't necessarily, although we've toyed with it, we wouldn't necessarily map meaning, materials and competencies as separate things. We've kind of got, Mark, keep me right, we've got to a point now where we're kind of saying we're mapping practice. So dispersing a practice or spreading a practice across multiple stages of maturity axis, probably not. Maybe that would, if it is, that's unfair. In one context, that would infer that particularly there's different perspectives of that practice. so that one person might see that practice as something that is conceptual, they don't understand, and another person in the team and the environment might see it as something they do on a daily basis. So this leads us down a different avenue around skill liquidity across a team. But yeah, I think I would generally think of that practice in its general position for that team. And what we've done with this is if there's maybe 3 or 4 people in the team who have much experience with the practice, we might sort of gravitate that practice towards their sort of joined experience, to say that's what the full contextual experience is of a practice.
And you had a slide where you showed different teams.
Yeah.
So in traditional Wardley mapping, you have a pipe where you can, for example, show how what's the evolution stage of the component. The component might be at different stages depending on where in the organization you look, or across organizations. So equally, if several teams or several members of a teams are doing the practice, you might want to show that spread as a pipe. One of the things, so I'm not quite sure, Chris and I disagree there a little bit, whether we really want to, whether we not want to map meaning material and competence separately. So I have done this a bit, but one of the things that I noticed doing it is essentially when there's a big discrepancy between how well you understand the 3 for a practice. So your understanding of the meaning, shared meaning in team is great, but and the tool is where it is. But the competences are really not coherent in the team, then it's likely also that the team has experienced many difficulties with the practices. So yes, I would probably then bias it to the weakest element. But at the moment, we don't see much value actually going to that low level of granularity. We might change our mind over time, depending on what's going to happen. So that's why currently we're actually only mapping practices as an entity rather than going and disseminate the practice internally. I think that might be interesting at some point when we want to see how we could translate learning in one organization to another organization. So let's say some of the DevOps or DORA practices can be explained in a way that you could say, okay, so yes, your context might be slightly different than another organization, but you're largely working with the same tools and the same kind of competitive space, etc. So some of the practices can be compared across organizations. And then let's say you are an organization that wants to learn from another organization that already has that, then it might become interesting to understand, yeah, which competences or which material you need to develop in order to have the same success that another organization has with that. But so we don't have examples for that right now. Because
where my question is coming from, if you don't mind me taking a couple more minutes of your time, was again one of the common things that you see in the industry is organizations or professionals who believe that since they've invested in the best tools, the best technologies, that they're the bee's knees, that they're doing everything right. So they may understand what they need to do. They have the best tech, they have the best gear, but maybe not the best competence. So it's more of a representational question I'm asking, rather than is this the right thing to do? But it's more along that if material is all the way out there on sort of, if I could consider it best or further to the right of that axis, but competence is all the way across, it's still emergent, then where would I position that collection, that practice, in order to start that dialogue? That's really where I was coming from. I see a lot of professionals who say, we have the best tech, therefore we are doing this the best.
So what we're talking about, the way I think about it is, it's the integration. That's what you're mapping. It's how you practice. So you may have the best tools, but if you don't have the best competencies, then you're not competent in the use of those tools, then your practice is not competent. Your practice is something you would see on the left-hand side and not the right-hand side. If you don't know how to use them, then you can't get value from them. So the best tools in that instance are, they don't help you with your capability. They don't allow you to do what it is you want to do, because you don't know how to leverage them, you don't know how to use them.
I agree. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Mark. I appreciate
So
taking the
I
time.
can also say from experience, so the social practice theory lens has helped me in one organization actually to prevent a premature adoption of a tool. So we were using tools, and the CTO or new CTO was appointed, and he says, oh, industry leading, we have to use this tool. Wanted to go and spend literally millions just licensing the tool and making promises to the exec of, hey, within 3 months, we're going to be wonderful. And by actually explaining to that CTO how we lacked all the competences needed to actually make use of the tool, we convinced him not to invest. So you can then basically focus them on the meaning. So what is it actually you're trying to achieve, and what are the competences and maybe tools or the practices that we have that we could promote to achieve your outcome, rather than just buying a tool. But that's the classical case that people go out and say, yeah, the reason we're not successful is we have the wrong tool. And the social practice theory lens allows you to say, yeah, it's a bit more complicated than that. There's more to it. And let's start looking at the whole picture, not just at the material.
Thanks, Mark. We are getting thanks already from the people. So is there any more questions, Dave, or any? I see our Petra also here. Petra, we were applying worldly maps a lot in Glassfall. Do you have any comments what you have seen in the areas that we are using?
Well, there's a lot of, there was a lot of information, a lot of stuff. This all looks very cool. I think I want to take a deeper dive into this. But it's super interesting. It is something very similar that we've been doing actually in Glasgow. I would say it's quite similar. We just didn't call it maturity mapping. We were just calling it worldly mapping. But yeah, it spiked my interest, definitely. It looks pretty cool.
Cool. So great. Next time, Petra, we'll have a lot of questions. So any other questions? If not, then we will we will give Chris and Mark to sum up the event. And I would like to say that from the chat, people are waiting blog posts from Chris, Mark, from you. They are waiting Miro template, PDF. So there are a lot of expectations out of this event. But I will give you just to sum up for today, and we will end. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Sum up. So I hope you found it useful. I hope you found it as a kind of interesting way, both through the maps and social practice theory, a way of kind of trying to understand an organization and what an organization does and what is the right, or how to understand and explore the options and how to improve and change the organizations. We have, as I said, maturitymapping.com has got a bunch of our blog posts, and one of the things we've been talking about is how to get that Miro template onto, I think it's called the Miroverse, where they have all of their kind of open sourced templates, so people can play around a bit. And things we want to do is, well, we kind of, as Petra's saying, we recognise the space that it plays with, or the Wordly mapping, and as you can see, it's completely inspired by Wordly mapping. We're kind of interested to hear about other people's experiences doing it. So we'll get these things out there for people to play with and try it out more.
Yeah, during our summit, there will be, of course, follow our summits, and there will be a lot of presentation from Wordly Maps as well. And yes, cool. I find it also quite interesting. All I will share with you the chat, and if there is unanswered questions, please might be by blog post or by somehow follow up with the people so that they get answers to the questions. And also recording, there were people who want to share with colleagues, will be available openly in the summit website. So please feel free to watch it then. Perfect. And Mark, do you want to add something?
No, I'm fine.
Okay, so thank you very much for a great session. I enjoyed it, and I think everyone enjoyed, because not every time that there's so many questions and so interactive that we are not then able even to answer the questions so many. So perfect session. Thank you, and again, looking forward to meet again. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much. See ya. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you.